Um, Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you.
No, thank you for having me on.
So there is a lot that I'd love to talk to you about, but one of the primary things that I did want to get your take on was obviously the situation of the media right now, particularly around media bias and how that's impacted things like polarization and the election and so on and so forth. I know that, I mean, right now there is very little trust in the media, particularly in the US. I'm Canadian and we're struggling with a similar problem. It's sort of just less
Pronounced.
dramatic.
Yeah.
Sure, pronounced. Less reality TV.
Right.
But, like I think, there's good reason for people not to trust the media. The biases have become really overt. It's not just like, oh, Fox Media or Fox News is biased. It's everyone. It's the liberal media. It's the mainstream media. It's the progressive media. Was there a certain point where you saw this change? Was there a certain point where journalism and news and reporting was, unbiased or nonpartisan?
Well, I don't think that the news really can be unbiased. I kind of grew up in the school, of journalists who believe that you're always revealing bias in one form or another. Depending, on the size of the headline, whether you place the quote in the third paragraph or the eighth paragraph, you're always going to be through every editorial decision letting your readers know what you think about things. But aspirationally, the business did have an aim of kind of cutting down the middle as much as they could on some issues, right? There was at least some effort to try to at least affect the appearance of objectivity, whether it was just in tone or style. And for me, I started to notice a lot of change in that format during Trump's first run, when it suddenly became really the fashion within the industry to take a much more aggressive politicized tone in terms of how we talked about that candidate. So the same sort of politicized, slant-driven format that Fox had employed for a couple of decades now became relatively standard on the other side. And, obviously there are huge differences too, but the core strategy was all about retention of audience, and not trying to go for everybody, which is what they used to do.
And do you think that there was any kind of good reason for that? Like, I suspect a lot of people would defend a bias in opposition of Trump, for example, because he's so dangerous. This is such a dangerous president that we have to go so over the top in criticizing him, lest he, destroy society as we know it.
Sure. I understand that point of view. And I think certainly editorially, like if you're going to have a point of view on the op-ed pages, or if you're going to be doing something like what I do, which is very heavily opinion-driven journalism, right, in the long form. But where I think there were two things that they did that I think were big mistakes. The first was, and this was actually, this was spelled out graphically in a pretty influential op-ed in the New York Times called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism," which was written in August of 2016. And they basically said that, we have to stop worrying so much about printing negative news about Democrats, because even though, our side has its faults, it doesn't produce news at the same rate. That was the phrase they used in the Times as Trump does. So they basically stopped looking and printing news that was critical, first of the Clinton campaign and then of the Democrats generally going forward. That was the first thing. And then the second thing was they in their just regular day-to-day fact-based coverage of Trump, There was a tone of emergency that was kind of new, and you basically knew what the facts were going to be or what the posture was going to be about every single narrative before you turned on the channel, which shouldn't be, because facts sometimes surprise you. Sometimes Trump isn't guilty. Sometimes he's not actually a Russian agent, right? So you can't put the cart before the horse, which is what this formula was really all about. It posed as an ethical decision. It was really a commercial decision. It was really, we're going to just pick this audience, we're going to maintain them. And once you make that decision, the editorial decisions flow automatically. And that's what happened. We had 4 years worth of automatic editorial decisions. And that's why people are as of today, there was a poll that said that majorities of Americans don't trust the news media, which is a first in our history.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you think was behind that? I mean, you say that they're catering to a particular audience. Is that a financial incentive?
Absolutely, yeah. So, and this was really the subject of the book I wrote, Hate Inc., which is the news business has gone through a lot of changes in the last 30 or 40 years. It's been fundamentally affected by things like the 24-hour news cycle, the arrival of the internet, which introduced all these new competitors that we never had to deal with before. The internet also destroyed our core advertising base, right? We no longer had, like ads for things like want ads or, back page listings for classifieds. That was the backbone of newspapers for a generation, and they were gone basically overnight. So this introduced all these new commercial pressures into the press. If you go back and look in the 70s and 80s or the 60s, you'll see that the old networks, they had a commercial strategy of trying to get the entire audience, right? So somebody like Walter Cronkite or a broadcast that was anchored by Jessica Savage or Dan Rather, it was anodyne, it was unemotional. They had a down the line, neutral style delivery, and that was designed to be a medium for the maximum amount of ads and to get the biggest and widest audience they could possibly get. When all these changes happened, they realized that it's no longer possible to get the whole audience. What the smart thing to do instead is let's pick a demographic and dominate it. And Fox was really the first channel to figure out that that's a great business model. What they did is they picked older, conservative, suburban and rural news watchers, and they fed them a stream of news stories that they knew that they would respond to. And that was extremely successful and put Fox at the top of the ratings. And now basically that's the model for everybody. Let's reverse engineer things and pick a target demographic and then ask ourselves, well, how does our demographic want to understand the events that just unfolded? And we'll give them that interpretation. And that's how you keep your audience, and that's how you can sell ads to that audience. And it's a business model that works in this fragmented, atomized system that we have.
I mean, and you wrote about the way that, for example, like Fox News called the attack on the Capitol, or they referred to those people as pro-Trump supporters or pro-Trump protesters, I'm sorry. And then the Atlantic referred to them as insurrectionalists,
Yep.
Which has also been, of course, what the liberal media, mainstream media, I'm not even sure what to call this kind of media because I don't know that they're particularly liberal, but.
Yeah, it's kind of blue-red generally. I mean, it's hard to, there's really two camps, let's put it that way. They're commercially at that level, there's two directions, and one ecosystem is basically Fox and a couple of other smaller organizations, then the other one is everybody else, so yeah. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I want you to interrupt me. I'm here to talk to you and listen to you. So please do. I'm not here to listen to myself talk. So do you think that what happened at the Capitol constitutes, a lot of media have been pushing for it to be called domestic terrorism, right? And I wonder what you think about that. I mean, do you think this qualifies as domestic terrorism, or do you think that's just like a media angle?
Well, first of all, I think that's a question that is difficult to settle that day, right? I mean, absent some overt statement of purpose and some overwhelming pile of information as to the motives and the planning that went into that event, you can't know in the first hours whether this was an actual attempt to overthrow the government and install a permanent, I don't know, martial law or whatever it is, without doing a little bit of digging and having a little bit of perspective on what's taken place. What troubled me about what happened in terms of the news response was it was immediate. They made immediate proclamations. This was an insurrection. This was a coup. This was, sedition, which is a very loaded and complicated word, right? And they applied it in all directions. Now, clearly, and I lived in a third world country. I lived in Russia and the former Soviet Union for over a dozen years of my life. I've been in places where coups actually happen. It was not a coup. There's no possible way you can call it a coup, because a coup has a non-zero chance of succeeding. It involves trying to actually take over the institutions of government. You could definitely call it all sorts of things that are very, very serious and perhaps felonies that would result in life sentences. You could call it felony murder because they broke into the Capitol and someone died in the commission of the act. There's all kinds of things you could label it, but you can't label it, I don't think, in looking back, I don't think you can label it as a coup attempt. I think that was overdone. But what we tend to do now in this system is we just jump to extremes, on both sides, right? Like, Fox will downplay it and say it was, just people having a laugh or whatever it was, and not being serious, or they'll even go further and say that it was actually the work of Antifa or agence provocateur or whatever it is. But the extreme rhetoric on the other side that was so immediate really just leaves no room for investigating the kind of in-between reality, which is what I think it was. I think what happened was it was Trump being extremely irresponsible. And we saw this going all the way back to the beginning of his first campaign, when there were a couple of men in Boston who beat up a homeless person and who had said that they were, inspired by Trump. And Trump first says, "Oh, that's awful. That would be a shame." But then he says, "Oh, well, these people really love America. They're patriots." And it's part of Trump's MO to try to spin people he knows are irresponsible to the wildest possible action while denying that he's doing it at the same time. At the same time, though, I think when we finally dig into what actually happened that day, we're going to find that it was a lot of people who went in there for a variety of reasons. There were probably some people who went in there with very serious and very scary intentions, probably to hurt people. And then there were other people who thought it was, more like a frat prank, right? Where they were going to go in and occupy an office and steal a couple of souvenirs and take selfies. So it's a spectrum of things, right? And which is what most news events are. But what we get mostly in the States now are very stark, caricatured pictures, immediately. And that's troubling.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that bothered me, and it, bothered, I think, a lot of people on the right, it's weird because the way that, polarization has happened, and because of these media biases, I've sort of been pushed into this, like, defending Trump and Trump supporters, just because I'm so tired of the way that they are framed and attacked, and I'm so tired of the overt biases and, the hyperbole, really, like the hyperbole drives me crazy. But well, I guess
to interrupt quickly. That's a thing. Like it's part of what happened in the last 4 years is, we now live in an atmosphere where people who work in the media know that if they're off off key even a little bit in their coverage of things, they're going to get an avalanche of criticism from all their colleagues. They may even get, a call from HR that, their jobs are in trouble. Like, if we've seen a number of episodes where people fall into serious professional trouble for not kind of towing the line on whatever the story of the day is. And it affects you, right? You don't like to be pushed around. You don't like to be forced to say something is X, Y, or Z. And that's very frustrating. Like, I know exactly what you're saying. Like, I am the farthest person from a Trump supporter, but I feel like I've been forced into this position a little bit, and it is irritating.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, and people accuse me of that, and people accuse like Glenn Greenwald of being a Trump supporter. Every time I post one of his articles, people chime in and say like he's like a fascist.
Right.
Like, he's so critical of the Democrats. And like, I mean, he's critical of many other things too, but like the binary is totally unreasonable, and it's very hard. It's hard to escape it. So I think at the end of the day, you just have to say what you think and try to tell the truth as much as possible, and just let people call you like a fascist and a Trump supporter, even if it's a bit ridiculous.
Sure. Yeah. But it has a very negative impact on this business because, traditionally, right, a lot of people who are sort of free thinkers went into this business. I grew up around newsrooms. My dad was a reporter. It was normal for everybody to disagree with each other in a newsroom. I mean, arguments were common. Everybody had a different point of view. We're all very individualistic. Now, the opposite is very true in news organizations. Like, it's very rare for people to step out of line and have a different point of view on things. And that's not a good thing, because I think the business works better when you have people who are unafraid to have a point of view.
Totally. And I mean, so one of the things that immediately annoyed me, and I'm trying to check my own biases around this issue, but it was the way that Biden responded to Antifa and the BLM riots and protests in the summer, and that violence that was happening and that destruction that was happening, and attacks on civilians, like attacks on like small businesses. Like, these people are not the enemies of anyone. And the Democrats, the liberal media, progressives, essentially, and for the most part, denied that violence was even happening, or they defended it because it's a worthy cause. And in this case, all of a sudden, it's very easy for them to be critical of this violence and of these attacks. And yeah, I mean, Biden's messaging around that, I just found so hypocritical. And I guess I've sort of been questioning myself too. I'm like, am I in the wrong? Was this something more serious? Like, is that bias okay within this particular context?
Yeah, well, I think throughout the last 4 years, the whole question of like, wow, am I crazy? Like, I think that's a common reaction that a lot of us had to a variety of stories. Long before last summer, I think the Russia story had a lot of people asking that question. Like, there were a lot of very good reporters I knew who I would talk to in private who would say things like, it seems so obvious to me that X is true, but every time I look on social media or media, I see that everybody's saying Y, and it makes me second guess myself. And I wonder, like, am I having a failure of perception, like, which is a scary thing in this business. With what happened with the protests, that it was so politicized over the summer, and you could agree with the general aims of those protests and still acknowledge that violence took place, that people died, and that there were things that there were clearly excesses that were resulted in victims that had nothing to do with the issue, that were small business owners or elderly people who lived in towns who weren't getting their medication because the pharmacy had been destroyed, or the owners of car dealerships where you had 74 cars boosted in a single night, or whatever it was, right? I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on last summer that wasn't wasn't purely about politics. A lot of it was just sort of mayhem, and that happens in this atmosphere. And there was a kind of a push both with politicians and reporters to avoid talking about that side of the story, which I think was a disservice to everybody, right? I don't think it was necessary to downplay all that in order to talk about the righteousness of ending police brutality. I think that actually detracted from it. And then another really odd irony was there was a moment in time in September when William Barr, who was Trump's attorney general at the time, said something about how he was considering bringing sedition charges against the people who organized the Chaz zone in Seattle. All right. And there was this tremendous hue and cry all over social media and in the press, like, that's absolutely ridiculous. What an abuse of government authority to use, such a broad and sort of unwieldy legal tool against these people, right? And yet, a lot of those same folks were very happy to apply that same label, to all sorts of people. And this was what I was talking about the gradations of guilt, right? So, there were probably people who were in the middle of organizing what happened on January 6th who maybe you could legally argue that was sedition. That's possible. But is it true of everybody there? Is it true of Trump himself? Is it true of people who supported Trump? Like, these are all different questions. And yet, they just kind of threw that word at everybody. And it was so clearly hypocritical based on their reaction to the invocation of the word earlier that year. So last year. So I don't know. Yeah, I know what you're saying, but it is frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it just ended up being a way to further justify accusing all Trump supporters of being white supremacists and of being hateful and of being violent and of being dangerous. And that's exactly what progressives did. And it's like, this isn't helpful. I mean, yes, some of the people there were white supremacists. Sure. Some of the people there are dangerous. But again, it's like not all, not all, not all. And I just wonder if they realize what they're doing. Like, I wonder if they realize that this kind of binary approach, this black and white thinking, this hyperbole, this, Trump is a fascist, everyone who supports him is a fascist, white supremacist, like it's harmful. It's not helping their cause. It's not helping the people who are Trump supporters. It's not helping bring people together. It's not creating a conversation. It's not protecting anyone from violence. I don't believe that using these terms and labels at the end of the day is going to protect democracy or stop violence. I in fact think that things are probably going to get worse.
Yeah, and using that language so broadly and so incautiously, I think, is the one predictable impact that it will have is that it's going to radicalize some people on the other side. And this goes all the way back for me to how did the press talk about Trump and why he was succeeding to begin with? Originally it was interesting. A lot of the reporters at the very beginning of the Trump phenomenon actually, I thought, did a pretty interesting job in trying to understand what was going on, because on the surface, it made no sense. Like, Trump seemed completely unqualified for the job. He was totally unserious. He had no knowledge of half the issues that he was talking about, and his temperament was insane. And he didn't even have a campaign. Like, normally candidates have a whole crew of people in tow, and they're carefully designing a ground game and policy papers. Trump was literally making it up as he went along. And so, by normal standards, it begged the question, like, well, what's going on here? Why are people responding this way? And initially people said they made some pretty interesting observations, right? Like, there were a lot of veterans in a lot of his crowds. Like, if you ask people, what are they doing there? They're saying, I'm tired of all politicians. I don't believe it anymore. I don't believe Republicans. I don't believe Democrats. I have, they had grievances about all sorts of things. Some of them were legitimate. Some of them weren't. There was clearly a lot going on with race and xenophobia at these rallies, but it was exacerbated by other factors. So in the same way, again, as lots of news stories are, it was a complicated picture, right? And in place of talking about that complicated picture as the campaign went on, and especially after he got elected, it became taboo to talk about that. Suddenly there was one explanation. It was all about race entirely, and Trump's movement was entirely a white supremacy movement. And it had nothing to do with factors that preceded Trump, which is interesting because I think anybody who covered presidential elections could have seen this coming without even knowing Trump was on the horizon, because there were all these breakdowns in trust with candidates that happened before 2015. So now you've caricatured the entire political process, and you've made it impossible to sort out the real explanation for things, which is the biggest issue that I have with all this. It's like, okay, if you want to just ignore what's actually happening and ignore, all these problems that are plaguing the country and just label it all white supremacy and say it's that, okay, that's fine. But that's actually not going to help anybody figure out the root of all these issues. And I just don't understand it, because you can say that race was a major factor and that the economic aspect of it just exacerbated that, or it made people quicker to leap to racial explanations, but they couldn't even do that. They had to go full bore and caricaturize the whole thing, which I think is a mistake. Just journalistically, I think it's a mistake.
Yeah, and I mean it's so difficult to even have that conversation because people react to you in a hostile way just for trying to understand the reasons why people would support Trump. I didn't understand in 2016 either. Like, I was totally shocked. I mean, I don't live in the States, and so I don't follow American politics as closely as many others do, but I just didn't understand it at all. I was like, why would somebody vote for this like crazy person?
Buffoon, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Total idiot.
Right.
And I was shocked that Hillary lost. And then, of course, I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. And I went to work trying to figure it out. And it makes sense. It totally makes sense if you're not going to be in denial about reality and what's happening in politics and what's happening in the media. But yeah, there's a preference to just, treat these people as hateful. And even if it were just about race, like, wouldn't you still want to understand what's behind that? Because there has to be something behind it. It can't just be a blanket, irrational hatred for any person of color or any immigrant or something like that. There has to be more to the story.
Or even if it is that, why now? Like,
right?
Why did this happen this year as opposed to 1996 when Pat Buchanan was running? Like, what? Or why wasn't why was there comparatively so little of this sentiment around when David Duke ran for the presidency? Why were so many of the people who voted for Trump Obama voters? That was a significant phenomenon, especially in sort of very scrupulously analyzed portions of the country, like Macomb County, Michigan, like these sort of auto worker populated regions. These are the places that American politicians want to understand the most, because they've tended to have a lot of say in elections. They've gone back and forth a lot. People who became Reagan Democrats in the 80s, they went back to Obama in 2008. Then they went to Trump in 2016. Well, what was that all about? What's going on in the minds of these people? Once you paint it all as 100% about race, you can't even investigate that question anymore. It's gone. So yeah, it was very strange. And the Trump story was a lot weirder also than it was presented. I mean, there were, I went to people at Trump rallies who would say things like, "Oh yeah, I just love his show. His show is so funny." And you would ask, the follow-up question immediately is, what does that have to do with the presidency, right? Like, how are you making that connection? But that was a legitimate American phenomenon. This whole, like, oh, I like him, I know him, therefore I'm going to vote for him. Like, what is that about? You know, that's another thing that's deeply screwed up about this country, but off the table because it didn't fit into the explanation. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, the thing around like Hillary Clinton being unlikable and Trump being likable, again, I didn't understand that either because I was like, what is it that you like about this person? But
well,
I think, sorry, go ahead.
well, I think for a lot of people, it was just, it's funny because Trump is he's so dishonest in the classic sense. Like, he lies about the facts of things all the time, but he's very revealing about who he is. Like, when he gets up on the stand, he's so different from other politicians who are reading to you from a script. You know, they see the audience as this, you know, as something to be conquered, like you know, a potential pool of customers for a company. They have this wall between them and the audience. Whereas Trump, who has narcissistic personality disorder and you know, he's psychologically driven to try to have immediate intimacy with whatever is in his vicinity. He was so, in a way, open with his audiences. They felt that he was more genuine than someone like Hillary Clinton was, and then on some level that was true. Like, if you listen to Hillary Clinton's speeches to Goldman Sachs, she's so relaxed and in her own element with those people compared to how she is on the stand. You could see how people had that reaction, right? They, like, Trump loves it. He's so happy when he's up on the stand in front of his crowds, you know, and he says things like, "Oh, I love the poorly educated." It pours out of him that he's thrilled to be with these people. And, you know, he's crazy, but that is a real thing, you know? So it's something that I think you have to spend a little bit of time watching him to really appreciate. But it makes sense in the, you know, once you get past the mental hurdle of saying there's no way anybody could actually like this person, and you start testing that hypothesis, it makes a lot of sense. But
yeah. I mean, I agree. And it totally makes sense to me now. And I even got to the point, like, leading up to the election, I didn't have to make this decision, luckily, where I was just so angry at the Democrats and I so disliked Biden that I was like, I don't know, maybe I would vote for Trump. Like, I guess that makes me a fascist white supremacist. Not because it's like, oh, well, I really love Trump. What a great guy. But
right.
because of these options, and because I genuinely do think that Biden is dangerous in certain ways, you know, there's different kinds of dangers, and they're not always so overt.
Yeah, I ended up not voting for either, and you know, my reasoning was, yeah, I am troubled pretty deeply by the race stuff with Trump. I think that's especially in kind of modern American society. He's, in key moments, he has exactly the wrong voice, you know, for a country that kind of needs to come together on certain issues. But the converse of that is that I always felt he lacked the discipline and the organizational skills to actually accomplish too much that was very destructive. Whereas I'm terrified of this new kind of model of government that the Democrats are embracing, which is, you know, very authoritarian, very censorship driven, very surveillance driven. And they scare me a lot because they do have the capability to use government in, you know, in the most skillful way, in the negative sense, right? So you're right, there's different kinds of dangers, and I just feel like the danger that's posed by the Democrats is enough that I just couldn't vote for them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's essentially what happened to me too. You know, I just got so worried about what was happening with big tech and censorship and free speech and the potential for surveillance. I mean, and I also had concerns around what Biden was going to do with the Equality Act and how that would impact women's sex-based rights and women's sports. And I just thought, you know, these things are so dangerous that I could not possibly support this candidate, no matter how bad the alternative is. These things really scare me. And I guess, I mean, I had wanted to ask you a little bit more about this domestic terrorism thing, just because I sort of wonder where, you know, there's a bunch of Democrats now who are pushing for domestic terrorism legislation and, like, you know, a really kind of extreme approach to whatever I'm not sure I really understand what they mean by domestic terrorism in this context, to be honest, but I'm just wondering what that legislation could actually look like, and what they're really talking about here, what they're really pushing for.
I think they're looking for they're looking for an enhanced ability to conduct the kind of surveillance and to use the same kind of tools that they use to track, potential Muslim terrorists in the early 2000s. And I think what people forget is that once that first war on terror got rolling, they built these massive structures that will never, ever be rolled back fully, that are out of control. They're crazy. You know, we went from, we adopted torture, we adopted mass warrantless passive surveillance of the entire population, where we're gathering everybody's data that's being collected. There's a huge regime of these things called national security letters, where the FBI will get interested in a person and they'll send a letter to a company and they'll say, there's a gag order preventing you from telling your customer that we're now going to take their data and analyze it. And they were doing that tens of thousands of times a year. There's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which allows you to listen to anybody who's communicating with somebody who's designated a target for foreign intelligence investigations. And I think what they're looking to do with this domestic terrorism concept is expand that to people who potentially could be part of what the new word, the word of the day is pro-Trump insurgency. We're seeing that all of a sudden today. So, the equivalent of no-fly lists or, new listening regimes, warrantless surveillance, all kinds of things that they're probably already doing. But in the past, they had to use tricks. There's a reason why a lot of the Russiagate story took place in England, because they couldn't legally conduct a lot of the surveillance unless they had a foreign angle to a lot of these stories. So I think what the intelligence agencies want is they want the capability to do what they've been doing overseas for 2 decades now. They want to be able to do some of that at home. And that should really freak people out, because I think most of the rest of the world understands that America has a very different view of international law than it did in even 1980 or 1990. We cross borders with impunity with drones. We assassinate whoever we want. We're conducting active military operations in all sorts of countries without having to ask for congressional approval. So it's a big power grab, and that's what I worry about with this, is that I don't even know what tools they would employ, but I'm sure they'll do their worst.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, and they're using people's fear to instill these measures, right? And I mean, you could make the same argument around Trump, that he's stoking fear to create polarization or to, take power or do what he wants to do, essentially. But I guess I'm wondering if you think that this accusation that Trump incited violence, which of course is what was used to defend his permanent suspension from Twitter, I wonder if you think that's accurate, because I think I mean, well, no, you answer the question. I won't answer the question. I just asked you.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think putting it this way, if you were to use the standard that we used in the past, in the press, we've had a standard going back to, I guess the Supreme Court case was Brandenburg v. Ohio in the late 60s. And the standard is imminent incitement to lawless action. So you are allowed to say almost anything as long as you're not directly instructing or inciting someone to do something, to do an imminent concrete action that's illegal. By that standard, I don't think Trump is guilty, right? But Twitter's a private company. They don't have to abide by the Supreme Court standard. And I don't love that argument. And I worry a lot about the precedent of a bunch of tech companies being able to cut off a president, even a terrible one, from the population, because, well, it suggests all sorts of things about who's actually running the country, but there's also the question of, if you're going to take Trump off, you have to apply that rule equally all over the board. And there's all sorts of malefactors on the web who are as bad or worse than Trump. Some of them are in countries that are openly autocratic, like Saudi Arabia or China or whatever it is. I guess they finally shut down the Chinese embassy Twitter account today. I don't. Yeah, I just don't love this instinct to constantly be taking people off the internet, because it ends up being a game of whack-a-mole. Like the tendency is once you use it once, people start looking around saying, well, who's next? Who's the next worst thing, right? And I said this when Alex Jones was taken off the internet. I said pretty soon they're going to be looking around for somebody who's, not quite as bad as Alex Jones. And that's sort of what happened. They went around and they started applying the same logic to all sorts of people on the left and the right, by the way. And so, yeah, it's a concerning phenomenon for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I wondered I wonder why you think that Twitter actually did that, because the tweets that they took Trump off of Twitter for were actually not that bad. You, as much as people have, you can't argue that he was literally inciting violence. That's not what he did. He may have been thinking it in his head, but I'm not comfortable with Twitter reading people's thoughts and deciding what they mean by those thoughts or what their intent is with those thoughts. What do you think happened there?
Well, back in 2017, at the beginning of all of the kind of anti-Russian sort of panic over election interference, all the platforms were summoned to Washington, and they were asked to come up with plans to prevent, what they called the fomenting or the sowing of discord. And it was made pretty clear by people like Senator Mark Warner of Virginia that if the companies didn't do more on the content moderation front, that they were going to be subject to a pretty broad new regime of regulation and taxation. And it was at that point that a lot of these companies, which incidentally had historically been not just disinterested, but actively opposed to the idea that they were editors of any kind. You had Mark Zuckerberg talking about how, we're not in the news business. We're a tech company, not a news company or a media company. They changed their tune after the Senate basically called them out in the carpet, which to me makes it a First Amendment issue, because now you have the government basically telling these platforms that you have to censor people or else. And so I think for a lot of these companies, they end up doing a calculation that We either have to come up with some kind of a content moderation regime that satisfies our political detractors, or we're going to go through some financial hardships, and we may even face action from some of our competitive rivals. I mean, look what happened to Parler recently. You know, Parler, which is nowhere near a company on the scale of Facebook or Google or Apple or anything like that, but they kind of bucked the system a little bit. And look what happened. You know, in the space of 24 hours, 3 companies, Apple, Google, and Amazon, were able to essentially remove the company from the internet. Now they've since gotten back on. But for me, that's what the calculation is for these companies. And I mean, in an ideal world, they don't want to have anything to do with this issue. But now they're facing it both from politicians and also in many cases from their own staffs. That's another phenomenon that's going on, where there's a lot of people who work in these companies who are letting people know that they consider, you know, allowing Trump to talk to be similar to, you know, IBM commiserating with the Nazi regime in the 40s or whatever it is, right? And so, you know, these people they have political consciousness and they're worried about that. I just think it's not the right move, you know, what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I was banned from Twitter, right? And in 2018.
Oh, for what?
For referring to a man as he, for saying that men aren't women. I mean, it essentially was picked off because I was vocal about the gender identity issue. Mm-hmm. So I still don't actually know. I don't really know what rule I broke, because I just got one of those form emails that says you're guilty of hateful conduct. And I appealed, and I just got back another form response. Nobody has ever explained to me what I did wrong. Actually, I think it was misgendering. Mm-hmm. The day that I was banned, you know, that evening there was an article that was published at Pink News saying Twitter has this new rule around misgendering and doxing, and now you'll be banned if you misgender, or not doxing, sorry, misgendering or dead naming. And I thought that was strange timing, and it had been, you know, I could tell that they were looking to kick me off. You know, all of a sudden somebody had been combing through my tweets and forcing me to delete various tweets, all with regard to this issue, none of which were, you know, violent or threatening or offensive as far as I'm concerned. You know, they were pretty straightforward comments and statements and questions. But I don't know exactly. I don't know if it was somebody working at Twitter who didn't like me. I don't know if it was mass reporting. I don't know if they were getting pressure from somewhere, but it was obviously targeted towards me. Like, I did have a pretty big audience, and I was one of the most vocal people on this issue. And I know that, you know, many people since, particularly men, I'll say, have said similar things to the things that I've said, and they have not lost their account. So it's, you know, it's likely they were trying to make a point. But in any case, yeah, I don't know what the process is there, and I'm not sure they really know what the process is. I mean, I think that they've kind of been put in this position where there's a lot of pressure on them, and they're making, as far irrational decisions.
Yeah, and the uncertainty of it has kind of a propaganda value in itself, because when you don't know what the rules are, you know, it creates this level of uncertainty in everybody's heads, where not only are you not going to try to push the edge of the envelope because nobody knows where that is, but the most likely calculation you're going to make is, I'm going to stay as far away from where I think the line is as I can, to protect in some cases, your livelihood, right? Like if your career depends on you being online, you're just not going to go anywhere near where you think the boundaries are for most people. And I don't know that that's healthy. I think I think one of the things that was so good about the system that we had that this is now replacing, which was litigation based, and it had very clear rules about what was libel and what was defamation and what was incitement. And there was a court process, and you knew exactly how you would be tried and who would be making the decisions, and evidence had to be produced. All of that. That was very empowering. Like if you were somebody like me, like an investigative reporter, and you're going after a big bank, say, you know exactly how far you can push the language because you know where the legal lines are. Mm-hmm. In this environment, nobody knows. And it can be completely arbitrary. And nobody's going to shed a tear if you're unfairly taken off the internet. I mean, like one of the first stories I did about this was in, I think it was 2018. Facebook did a series of mass deletions, and they just sort of wiped out a bunch of companies by claiming that they were foreign or that it was coordinated inauthentic activity. And some of them were like mom and pop little independent news organizations that had sunk a ton of money into Facebook ads and into their businesses, and they were just gone, like overnight. Nobody's going to say anything. And there's no recourse. So it's concerning. It's a completely new environment speech-wise.
Yeah, and that's the situation that I was in, right? Like I'm independent, and I've always been independent. And, the reason that I was able to talk about these things and write about these issues, the issue of gender identity, it's a controversial issue. Like I know that. And I know that I sort of had the freedom to talk about this really openly and honestly was because I was independent. Like there was nobody that could fire me. But at the same time, I'm totally dependent on these platforms. And so now I'm hyper paranoid about what I say, because if I lose another platform, I lose the ability to make a living. And, you lose your ability to connect with an audience. It's art. I mean, it has had an impact on me in a number of ways, because it's hard, it's hard for me to contact interviewees and sources, and it's hard for me to be a part of the conversation. But it is, and I was shocked when I was kicked off. I didn't expect that. I could tell that somebody was, picking at my account, but I didn't actually think they were going to ban me for saying that men aren't women. I mean, that seems crazy, but apparently not. I'm wondering if you think that these social media companies should be intervening at all in terms of what their users are posting.
Well, sure. I mean, I think they have to, and they're on some level. You can't have a complete free for all, because, and we don't. Like, people call me a free speech absolutist, but I always point out that everybody who works in the media can't be an absolutist. You navigate a dozen different rules every time you publish anything. Again, whether it's hold on. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, buddy. I'll be right there. It's my son. Sorry. So yeah, you're always navigating different rules, and when it comes to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram or whatever it is, well, they have to start with child pornography, threats, that stuff has to go. I think, if you want to be a functioning company, unless you're going to provide a very different kind of service, right? Like if you go on 4chan, where there's no boundaries whatsoever, and that's what that service is all about. But that's not going to be what 99% of the market is going to be interested in. Where I worry about is where they start making decisions about factuality and then political ideas. And the reason I worry about that is because these are tech companies. They're not media companies. They're not journalism companies. If they were, they would probably have a little bit more sensitivity to the fact that there is no mathematical right or wrong in probably like 99% of the things that are reported upon. And even if you're asking 50 experts on an issue and all 50 of them tell you something, it's very possible that like within a week they're all going to be proven wrong. Like that happens all the time in journalism. Just to take an example, like the 2008 financial crisis, basically every expert who was asked in the initial months and weeks after the collapse of the economy said, well, this was, it was just like a weather event, where people were just overheated in the mortgage markets, and there's no corruption that was really causing this. Well, that turned out not to be true. It turned out there was mass fraud behind that episode. Same thing with like pronouncements about, health or masks or the efficacy of this drug versus that drug. Like experts turn out to be incorrect all the time. They changed their mind about that issue last year. So once they start getting into the business of preventing certain things on the basis of whether they're true or not, they're bound to make mistakes, A. And then B, there's an additional problem of the only deceptions that are guaranteed to flower kind of uncontrolled are the official ones, and they're the most damaging, right? So they're going to clamp down on the stuff that comes from the fringes, but they're probably going to allow the biggest, worst lies, like WMDs in the early 2000s when we were going into Iraq, because those are the authoritative sources telling them that. So, I think the scariest episode in that direction was the one where they stopped the Hunter Biden story on Facebook and Twitter. And again, I don't think that story was necessarily all that important. It didn't strike me as a hugely important story, but factually, I think it was probably correct in the essentials. The information in it was probably true. And so now they're taking away something that's not incorrect. And people are going to interpret that as a clearly politicized decision. And they're going to get upset about it. And for me, that's just a rabbit hole that they shouldn't go down, because it's going to end poorly.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I don't feel comfortable putting trust in these corporations and these companies to be making decisions about what's true and what's not true and what kinds of ideas we can discuss and debate. I mean, like, it's one thing to talk about pornography, child porn in particular. It's one thing to talk about, maybe literal incitements to violence, like literal violent threats, sure. But when we get into, what facts are true and what facts are not true, and whether or not we can have conversations about, like, again, in my case, like gender identity and what a man is and what a woman. I mean, these are debates that are happening in the public sphere that should be happening in the public sphere. And I mean, the COVID thing is a great example, because the facts have changed as we've learned more about the virus. And, Twitter or Facebook, for example, or YouTube making decisions about which facts people can discuss is like, it's terrifying. And I feel like a lot of people are not as scared as they should be. I think people should be way more concerned about this issue than they actually are.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not sure whether or not it's so weird. I mean, I grew up at a time when to be politically liberal in America meant responding with like tremendous sensitivity to any suggestion that speech be curtailed in any way. I mean, it was a huge issue when Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, wanted to put labels on rock albums if they used dirty language or they had satanic themes or whatever it was. I mean, that was just putting labels on record albums, and it had the whole country in a frenzy for like a year and a half, right? We had congressional hearings over it. Remember Frank Zappa and Dee Snider, they were testifying. There was another major controversy when the Reagan administration was making a ton of noise about expanding the definition of pornography, and they had the Attorney General do this massive report on it. There were bans of NWA songs, and people were up in arms about that. How could you possibly ban, this song from the radio? And all of a sudden, those same people who were so freaked out about that are not worried about this. And this is like, orders of magnitude more serious. I mean, it's not even close. When you talk about taking things off Facebook and Google, this is basically the bulk of media distribution in the Western world, right? And if they start getting into the business of deciding who gets to see what, and they already do in countries like Israel and all over South America, they're doing this already. Like China, obviously, well, it's not necessarily those companies, but in many countries around the world, there's already this sort of tacit agreement between the big companies and whatever the ruling autocratic government is. They start doing that in the Western world, it's incredibly serious. It just baffles me that people in the media aren't more freaked out about it, because this is like our institutional livelihood that's at stake, and I don't understand it. So
I don't understand either. I'll let you go soon. I'm assuming you have to get to your child.
Okay, yeah.
I read a quote in a Politico article yesterday. It said, the most important element is to stop inciting, encouraging, polarizing, and dividing. And that's going to stop on January 12th. And I think that's been like a pretty common statement. Like, all this violence is going to stop. All the polarization is going to stop. Now that like Biden's in charge, we can all get back to normal. Thank God. Do you think anything's going to change?
Well, I think the profits of a lot of these companies are going to go down. Both Fox and CNN and MSNBC, without Trump, they're losing a major profit driver, because division and conflict sells, and he's an automatic driver of polarizing news stories. I think actually Fox might weather this storm better, because they're going to be able to look at basically all the actions of the kind of elite consensus, and in coordination with the Biden government, and they're going to be able to complain about it every day. And that's probably going to be enough for most of their audiences. I don't know what CNN and MSNBC are going to do. They're going to have to hunt people like Trump down and get quotes out of them every day to make news, because they've basically based 100% of their business formulas around him for years. So obviously we're not ending the division. It's just a question of like how big of a quantity of polarizing news there is out there. And that'll be interesting to see. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they're going to find a way to keep stirring us up against each other. I just don't know how it's going to work on kind of the blue state side of it.
Yeah, it's not quite as easy now, I suppose.
Right.
I wonder if you think that, do you think that there is a genuine danger from the far right? Like, do you think that that's a real thing that people should be worried about? And do you think that the far right is any worse than the far left? I mean, I don't even know what these categories mean, to be honest, but in as far as what people would understand that to mean, I suppose, like Antifa, I guess, would represent the far left for sure. These guys who attack the Capitol would represent the far right. Other than that, I think the categories are a bit vague. But
I do think that there's danger, sure. I mean, if you again, if you spend any time scrolling through far right-wing message boards, it's kind of an eye-opener. Like, there's a lot of stuff on there that freaks even me out, and I feel like, as a journalist, I'm not supposed to be. It's like being a doctor being upset by blood. Like, I'm not supposed to have a strong reaction to this stuff. But it's there's a lot of people out there who are really, really angry, and this is the United States. You have to remember where people are heavily armed, right? So it's a situation. I have friends who worked as journalists in Yugoslavia in the early 90s. And this is obviously not exactly an analogous situation, but that also was a heavily armed population that was being kind of fomented against itself. And the people who seem like they're mostly just big talkers and seem pretty harmless, all it takes is for somebody to start shooting and suddenly they become like warlords. That's what happens in these situations. So I can't say that I'm totally discounting the possibility of a real danger on that side. The reason that I wasn't terribly concerned during the Trump years is that I just never thought that Trump had any control over the institutional forces in American society. Like, he didn't have the intelligence agencies, he didn't have the Pentagon, you didn't have the media, didn't have the banks. Like, if you want to make real mischief, you have to have some institutional control. And he never really had a foothold in any of those places. Like, he couldn't even get, Radio Free Europe and Voice of America under his own control. I mean, he had during the 4 years he was there. So he was kind of like an interloper sitting in the White House by all appearances. So that to me is why, you talk, I don't know if you call it the left, but whoever is in control of the White House now, they worry me more probably than the far right does, just because, that it's the next war on terror or war in Iraq or whatever it is. That's more scary to me a little bit than the potential for the other thing. Also, this new direction of a domestic war on terror, which is probably going to be aimed also at the democratic process a little bit. Like, there's lots of propaganda out there suggesting that, we have to do more to make sure that people don't make the wrong decisions. Like, that makes me very nervous. That kind of rhetoric is very scary to me.
Yeah, for sure. So I will let you go soon. I promise I wasn't lying. So you made the move to Substack. Can you tell me why you decided to do that?
I had some experience with Substack. I serialized a couple of books on there. I was familiar with it. My situation is different than, say, like Andrew Sullivan or Glenn Greenwald, in that I think those guys were more like forced out of the organizations they were in. I still have a good relationship with Rolling Stone. I still kind of work there. I have a podcast there, and I do some writing for them. But I think I had an idea last year that I was starting to see where the media landscape was going, and that this sort of audience-supported model was kind of the future, for a couple of reasons, both financially and also editorially. Just having the complete freedom to say what you want. Not that I was terribly worried about that at Rolling Stone, because they always gave me a lot of freedom, but this guarantees it. This is and I think that's going to be increasingly an issue for people in journalism. I think it's not an accident that you're seeing all these people leaving legacy media organizations and going to places like Substack or Patreon, because they just can't take that stifling atmosphere within these newsrooms. So for me, it was more of career calculation, but I think for a lot of people, it's more of a speech issue. And I don't think it's going to solve everything either. Like, I still think you need to have big institutional mechanisms that do investigative reporting and have enough money to report on things that are happening around the world. This is a solution for a few scattered voices that already have followings, but it's not a solution to all the ails the media.
Right. And like, as far as a solution goes, I mean, I know that you just recently wrote about the need for new media channels, right? For nonpartisan media channels. I wonder, like, how do you see that working in terms of a funding model? I mean, I think that might be the primary challenge.
I think there's a huge audience out there. I think it's a big enough audience that if you were to build even just a news organization that was not even innovative, but just went back to the kind of objective standard that even the news companies used to have in the 70s or 80s, even if it was just that, I think it would probably do pretty well as a product in the news landscape. And you'd probably be able to sell enough ads to survive, but I'm not sure. I think, the traditionally journalism in America has always been subsidized in some degree or another. Either, the news divisions were buried in bigger companies that made their money somewhere else, like CBS, right? They made their money doing sports and entertainment, and they lost money on the news until 60 Minutes came along. That's probably, some combination of that and or maybe like a ProPublica type of model. But I do think that, like, if they did a really good job of just being a traditional news service, that it could probably sustain itself just on the just using the financial methods that we already employ, like ads and subscriptions and things like that, would probably work well enough, especially since things are cheaper now, right? Like, in the old days, if you wanted to have, CBS News and you want to do news from Moscow, you had to have a Moscow bureau, and you had to have tons of really expensive equipment, and there was lots and lots of money you had to pay for constant upkeep. Now, like, you can do that stuff over a phone, and it can be a stringer who has another job over there, like, it costs a fraction of what it used to cost. So somebody's going to reimagine a pure kind of news company, and I think it's going to be great, but we're just not there yet.
Right. And finally, how do you think that we can deal with this issue of social media censorship? I know you just started doing a column or a series, The Censored.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not only with regard to social media censorship, but you interviewed Abigail Schreier, and it's a real problem, and it's a real problem that people support it. I mean, I think that in many cases, a lot of progressives or liberals support the censorship of books like Abigail Schreier's book, or the banning of Trump from social media, or maybe banning people like me from Twitter. I actually did get a lot of support because it seemed so silly, but I think people think that they're stopping hate or stopping harmful ideas from harming individuals. But we do everything online now. I mean, it really has the power to control what we think and say and how we communicate with each other. And I'm just not really sure what to do before it's too late. I mean, it's almost too late now.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think people, obviously, you never start a censorship campaign with people who are sympathetic, right? So they always start it with people who everybody can't stand, like Alex Jones, right? And then they gradually up the ante, and then you add the fact that there are other social controls involved, that people are afraid of sort of dropping out of an in-group that exists online. They don't want to lose the kind of collective approval of all their friends and this echo chamber and social media. So they kind of stay within it. And then as the group identifies certain people as enemies or as purveyors of hate speech or criminals or whatever it is, it just becomes easier and easier for people to believe that the more they stay locked in their own little groups. And, that's what I worry about, right? Like, now nobody in America, and I don't know how this is in Canada, but the idea of defending free speech as a principle, as opposed to free speech for specific person X versus specific person Y, that's gone. Like, there was a time when we actually celebrated it in this country when the ACLU defended the right of the Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois. That was something they taught us in school. It was like a big deal. Like, this is how we understand freedom of speech in this country. And this is what makes us better than some other societies, is that we encourage this kind of thing, right? And there's a new belief system in America that I think is probably pretty prominent in academia, above all, that believes that allowing that certain kinds of speech is tantamount to supporting it, and that we need a new approach. And I think those folks are just going to have to find out for themselves that that's not true. And it's going to take a while for them to realize that, clamping down on speech is like a primary component of every authoritarian society in the world. There's never been like a really healthy, vibrant democracy that had lots and lots of speech controls. It just doesn't exist. Not in peacetime anyway. And it's going to take a while for people to see it, I think. They're not there yet. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's unfortunate that a lot of people might have to learn that lesson the hard way. I just hope that it's not, the hardest way.
Yeah. I mean, because it's going to take a lot of, these companies are so huge and they dominate the landscape so completely. And every time somebody breaks off and tries to form something new, they just buy it. Look at the relationship with Instagram and Google. Like the market is also broken. Like their antitrust laws aren't being enforced, so it's like a double whammy. There's this tendency towards conformity and sort of political conformity that kind of reminds you of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers a little bit, and you add to that this growing concentration of corporate power that goes unchecked completely. And it's sort of a worst case scenario for things like speech, because it's all it takes is a handful of people to make decisions, and there's no legal mechanism to stop it because it's all privatized. So yeah, it's tough. Even if people were to trying to oppose it, it would be tough.
Yeah, for sure.
So sorry to end on that note. Yeah.
I mean, I started it.
Yeah.
It's like, this is terrible and there's nothing we can do.
Right.
But it was really great to talk to you. I really appreciate
thank you,
your
Megan.
time. Thank you so much. And I love your work. And
thanks for having me on, and enjoy Mexico. And I am.
All
right. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.